Willie and I, to start off, will really look a little bit more about the importance of leadership and how can we and we need to use leadership to drive genuine impact. Hi, Willie, how are you doing?
Yeah. Hi, I'm well, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can. Yes, I can.
Great. Yeah.
Brilliant.
Thanks very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
No, the pleasure is all mine, to be honest. And I am really delighted that we are looking at leadership together because, many moons ago, I did a PhD and it was on leadership and how people are driving, sustainability from the ground up, which at the end of the day, 15 years later, I am still doing. But I think,
Yeah.
with your work at the university, what I also really wanted to elaborate and to think a little bit about, because leadership is a broad concept and often we only look at leadership as to where we are at today with the people that we work with the leaders that we see in the industry. But at the same time of being based at a university, do you actually think that we are preparing leaders for the world that is coming, or are we still training those for a world that is already disappearing?
Yeah. I think that's a question I sit with every semester, honestly. And I don't know what the honest answer is. I think mostly the latter, unfortunately. I say this because simply the curricular that I encounter, and I've reviewed actually a great deal of them across continents. I mean, we're still largely organized around optimizing the existing system. And I mean, of course, these are real skills to do that. But you could argue that optimization has its place, and it's the question whether you can optimize your way out of a systemic crisis. And I sort of think that leadership today, when I speak to students and when I analyze this, it's something different. I think it really requires us being comfortable with sort of complexity, and I've written about this not too long ago, being able to hold that long time horizon when you have every quarterly report that's pulling you short. And since, you have to remember that most tourism programs these days are sitting or embedded within business schools rather than standalone. And it demands a bit of tolerance for the kind of decisions that actually don't show up well in profit and loss statement for 5 or more years. And I think this is, you were talking just now about data, and in some ways, the gap in this case isn't data. It's because we're quite good at measuring things, but the gap is quite structural, at least in education. And, I would argue, I've written a paper about this, I would argue that ecology should be a core module in every hospitality and tourism program in the world, and it isn't. And that tells you something. And maybe just to quickly finish on this, I've read recently the work from Rutger Bregmans on moral ambition, right? The idea that we should be training people to solve the hardest problem, not the most convenient one. And so I've started to ask my students this at the start of a beginning of a semester. So what problem do you think you're being trained to solve? And they'll tell you usually, oh, it's matter of occupancy, or it's revenue management, or it's maintaining growth. And that tells you, because the gap between their answers and what we actually need to do is quite instructive, isn't it? And a little uncomfortable, actually, which is probably where we should start, actually.
No, I totally agree. And again, it's so important to understand what we have and how we can accelerate those that are already on the ground. But if you're not training the next generation in a way of what is yet to come, the change will never happen. And I think, as an industry, we need to change, we need to evolve, we need to push forward. And I think we need to really think about things differently. And I think having been surrounded by lots of young people last week in Switzerland is like they think different. They look at
Yeah.
the world in a different way and they question us a lot about the assumptions we've made or what is the status quo. And to be honest, it is the first thing where you realize you are 18 years old or maybe 20 something, and you're like, you think you know better, but at the same time, it is also really, I found it really interesting because
It's refreshing.
they
Yeah.
might do. They might actually know better. And it is maybe for us
Yeah.
to listen and be like, we shouldn't disregard somebody just because they're in their 20s, like, and say it's like, oh, what do you know of a world? Because actually they will be the one in 10 years' time that have our jobs and that are leading the
Yeah.
world.
Yeah, exactly. And it tells you quite a bit. So, I mean, they're coming all fresh, and then the educational structure of universities puts them in a box. And
Yes.
that's what's sometimes difficult. But I'd like to turn the question back to you, because if I look at the long run community, I mean, you have something that's generally quite rare, because you have leaders that have built businesses around that deep ecological and community commitment. So you're a group that's a little bit on their own. But I want to ask about the at the end of the journey, perhaps. So I turn the question back to you. Sort of, how are your members actually preparing to hand over that legacy to that next generation that I'm speaking to, right? I mean, is that perhaps the harder version of that question is, have they built something so personal, so value driven that is actually difficult to pass on? Perhaps impossible. I don't know. And so I turn back the question to you. What's your experience in terms of leadership and the next generation?
Yeah. Well, to be honest, I think it is good to see it from both sides. I think it is also hard. I can see how it can be hard for a young person coming into the industry and wanting to lead something in it and being disregarded. But I think it is also, and I think in the long run, it's a privilege to work with a lot of incredible people. And I think, having worked at the long run for 15 years, I've never been bored because they're great people that really want to walk the talk. But it does mean that you also have incredible businesses that maybe for 10, 20, 40 years, in some cases even, you've created a business and sometimes it's your baby. It is the thing that you
That's
hold
right.
so dear, and it is hard. And I think many are acutely aware of it. And even we as a long run have been acutely aware of it for many, many years. That doesn't mean I think it is easy to solve, because I think if you want to hand over your legacy, and ultimately that's what it is, I think you have to realize when you hand it over, it will change. And it means maybe the shoes that you have created for yourself are not being able to fill, but they may look different, they feel different, and the business may evolve. It may not just be your vision, but it is, the vision will grow. But I think it is that conundrum between sometimes you have to let go, to let the child grow up, to be a teenager and eventually become an adult. And I think, realizing that just because it is changing doesn't mean it is worse. It can mean it's actually going to be stronger and the vision can change. But it is hard. I think it is very hard for people, not just because they can't let go, but I think it's also hard to be like, well, letting come. So it is on both sides where it's like it is very hard. And often when you especially deal with the next generation, they may not want to take over, especially if it's family-owned businesses or small businesses. And that is also a reality that we all need to face. So how do we protect the business? How do we create those values we've created, that ethos and that vision? How can we integrate that into a business in a way that is actually permeating the whole organization? So it's not depending on one, it's depending on all of us to do our part and then evolve that together. And I think that's, for me, that is really important. And what I've seen in many businesses, those that thrive have learned to have really strong internal systems, processes. Everybody understands the vision. Everybody understands how they are contributing to it. And they have learned to trust somebody else and other people that they come in, but also to be open about it and discuss. I think there's a huge need for this transition, for generations to talk, for different people, different stakeholders to talk. So you can also redefine, because maybe what we thought the vision is 10 or 20 years ago, maybe that has changed, and that's okay for it to have changed. But we do need that to move forward. And I think there is a lot of help I think businesses will need to just think it through, just because I think it is a hugely emotional process to both letting go, but also letting come and being able also as the next generation to step into the shoes and mold the shoes to whatever you think maybe is to come. But
Yeah.
yes,
Yeah,
sorry.
these, I mean, no, I was just saying, I mean, because I think what you're talking about is this whole concept about succession is very complicated in many ways, because entrepreneurs tend to often build vacuums rather than bridges, right? Because they've so much into their own personal, as you said, this little baby in some ways. And in a way, you sort of almost need to institutionalize all these values that you bring in so that it's so anchored in your right in your processes that you can pass it on. And that's so difficult at times, I think, for entrepreneurs that are so passionate, but very important, of course.
Yeah, no, but it is. And I think this is where a big shift is seen, where we need to realize that we're not depending on just the one person being that that key person, that leader, the only person that can, but actually the word institutionalizing, embracing, embedding, I think are the words that really we need to pay a lot of attention to, because then it's the whole that we can protect rather than just the one element in it. But for me,
Yeah,
actually, the work institution also
I
is a big one,
I
because
know.
the other thing that you do a lot is like you've just hosted a big panel at ITB. You were with me in COP 18 months ago, and it's like, there's a lot of institutions that are demonstrating leadership in a way for us as an industry. But to be honest, I would love to praise that question too. Are we as an industry actually moving forward, or are we just really good at talking about moving forward? And in a way, also just going in circles and just like to hear our own voices.
Yeah, yeah. So I've done quite a few years now of ITB and other of those things. I mean, I don't want to say I developed some kind of radar for it, but the tell isn't actually what gets said. It's what doesn't usually get the applauses. I want to give you an example. If someone stands up and says, we need to reduce the number of visitors at this destination, usually the room will go quiet. And that's quite a signal, right? When someone names a specific business that perhaps is an extractive model and doesn't immediately walk back to, oh, of course, but we have massive opportunity. That's also a signal. So when a panel like we've had at ITB where there's some disagreement in real time and we're not necessarily converging to a polite consensus, that's also a signal. And I feel like saying like noise around, because we talk a lot in this industry as well, noise is where, every session would end up, oh, and there's so much reason to be optimistic. Of course, there are some reason to be optimistic, but it's not always like that. And noise is also when you see that greenwashing is so sophisticated that it takes you a good 15 minutes to spot. I think this is, we're getting so sophisticated through the language that we use and through the tactic that it's difficult to spot. So, I think one of the practical tests that I've seen and now in 2026 recently at the ITB is, are the leaders willing to say the difficult things in public? Is just not in a green room in the back, which is often what happens. When the whole tourism industry is built on the cost to local ecosystems and the communities, they pay for it, but they never invoice for those costs. That belongs in the main stage. That doesn't belong in the green room. So, it doesn't belong in a corridor. So, the question is whether we're ready to move these conversations to strategy. And I think the process of talking about it is part of, the movement forward. Of course, there will always be players that tend to, have nice end of the year corporate reports, and that's basically it. But I do think there is movement. I mean, there is and I think your members are perhaps the proof of it. But you're not only the long run, but generally speaking, there is some movement out there. But yes, we do talk a lot in this industry, so it's sometimes a big challenge for sure and we've sort of called for more regulations by the fact that we talk a lot. I mean, we're responsible of our uh, own this mice in this respect, I guess, in some ways. Yeah,
Yeah, but
it's
we
tricky.
do need to, but it's a difficult balance of being like, how much do you share or talk about or not talk about? And at the same time, I can also see there's like, it's okay, for example, for us to just say the uncomfortable truth, but if nobody else does it, then you're also very easily either being the only one, or everybody just is more important to protect their own image or that of the organization rather than actually wishing to protect the greater good, which is actually all of us in the tourism industry wishing to move forward. But it does mean working together. It does mean we need to say the things that we all think so we can address them.
Well, I mean, I think I could turn the question back to you because you have experience. I mean, your members are clearly moving faster than, generally speaking, the industry on many of those topics that we've talked about. So, how do you actually change the broader picture? Like, how could the industry move forward if the voices on the ground had genuine representation? Because this is often one of the issues that we see if I attend some of the large trade shows or large conferences is, how do you move forward if when the voices on the ground had representation. So not the seat at the table, but like that real influence of what gets decided there. So I feel like turning the question back to you. How do you do it at the long run? Where do you see the gaps, perhaps?
Yeah, to be honest, I think for me, like speaking, like when we were at COP together, this is my personal nightmare. I can be very honest about it. It is not the place I want to be. Definitely not. But at the same time, it's like it's the place we as a community need to be. And, if we can help our members, just saying sometimes, well, everybody says, there's a lot of finance for nature and conservation. And I'm the only one who's like, well, that is great, but it ain't going to the members that we are
Yeah.
representing who are at the front run. Somebody has to say that. And I'm happy to be that role or for the long run to play that role. But I think we need more organizations and we need to find more pathways for the voice of private businesses from all of our small tour operators, travel designers, accommodation providers to be heard. Because I do think there's a lot that policy and at the global level can learn from what the reality is on the ground. Otherwise, again, we are talking always to the same people, but we are not actually creating any systems or any tools or mechanisms to really empower those that are shifting the needle. But it is a hard one because, advocacy is not our role. But yet at the same time, I feel like we will, and we will continue to do that because it is this inspiration, this voices on the ground that I really think can inspire others and move it forward. I am very conscious of time because I know you and I can talk a hell of a lot more. But
Yep.
I know Rosie will be not so happy if I run over. So just in like a few words, can I just ask, is like, there's a lot of things, but what is, I think, one of the uncomfortable truths that you think that the industry needs to accept and that we need to be serious about if we want to accelerate impact? What's the one thing that we really need to grapple with, discuss, or face?
Okay, so I think this industry is addicted to growth, and growth and impact are not the same thing. And I think this is one of these uncomfortable truths. I mean, we spent 30 years building a story in which there are, more tourism that's done better equals more good. And I mean, it is an elegant story to sell, really. But at some level, it's also a convenient one because it means we don't have to choose. We do both. We do growth and impact. And then we say, okay, we do this, and within growth and impact, all we have to do is improve. This is what we do at hospitality school, what I said at the beginning. But of course, we come to the argument that in some cases, volume and anything around regeneration are generally in tension. And we cannot offset our way into this. And even sometimes within that regenerative story, I see even the good version, you still tend to get it packaged as a growth stories. I mean, it's going to be a premium positioning. It's going to be new markets, high yield per visitor, and it's always finds its way back to more. And perhaps the uncomfortable truth is that in some destinations, for some business model, for some operators, less is the correct answer. Deeper, slower, more deliberate value creation. I think this is where we have to sit quite comfortably here. And that's, it's not a message that will get applause. I know this in a room full of people when the livelihood depends on occupancy rates. I understand that. But if we're generally serious and not just performative serious, that conversations I think we need to stop avoiding. And I think the people in this room are the ones that, will be able to, will have no excuse to have it, I think. And we're probably going to hear it about it today. So perhaps that's my take. What would be yours? What would be your inconvenient truth?
To be honest, I personally think we want the same thing. Please, I think we need to stop playing in our little playpens and collaborate. It is not about just,
Mhm.
protecting the long run. It's not about all of these organizations. We need to collaborate. If you want to shift the needle together, I think collaboration at all levels, not just for our good, but for everybody's benefit, I think is key. And I think there is too much fragmentation. There's great work. There's a lot of replication. And I think there's a huge need for all of us just to genuinely collaborate, share, and create true movement that we are all part of. But Willie, thank you so very much for opening the third virtual impact show with me. It is always a pleasure, and I can't wait to see you again real soon. I know we will chat.